Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Tim Dietrich. I am an independent developer based out of Richmond, Virginia. I do a lot of work these days in integration, a lot with NetSuite and a crazy API that they have called SuiteScript. And I use Xojo a lot to facilitate things like add-ons to NetSuite, and I do all kinds of stuff. I've been developing with Xojo since 2014, and this is my third time being at XDC, and I want to say it's my fifth session, or something. I don't know. I think I did 2 last year and 2 the year before. I don't know. So, but even though this is my fifth time, I'm still nervous. So, so there you go. So I'm going to talk today about webhooks. How many of you know what webhooks are? So some of you. Okay, so what I'm going to do is explain what they are and why they're so popular, why I think you're going to enjoy using them and working with them. I'm going to explain the differences between webhooks and APIs, because when I tell you what a webhook is, you're going to say, well, that sounds a lot like an API. There are some differences, and I'll try to explain what those are. And then I'm going to show you how to develop Xojo applications that both receive webhooks and send out webhook notifications, which will make a lot more sense in a few minutes. And then I'll wrap up by discussing some of the best practices for implementing webhooks if you should decide that you want to do that. Am I speaking loud enough? Is you good? Okay. All right. He said what? See, I've repeated the question. I'm 1 for 1. So let's talk about what webhooks are. So I came across an interesting tweet. I don't know when I came across this, and I actually went back looking for it because I thought it was kind of interesting. But someone described a webhook as a push notification for your API, which will make a lot more sense in a minute when I get into this and you see what they are. But in terms, like technical terms, a webhook is basically a callback that's triggered by an event that happens on some source system. And basically what it all comes down to is something happens on system A, and it lets system B know that that event occurred. So it's great for doing things like syncing or extending some system where you want to add some additional business logic. I think when you see what webhooks are and you see how they work, you'll start to think, well, I could actually use that for this and for that. So one of the reasons, or some of the reasons that webhooks are so popular, is that they're very easy to configure. As a matter of fact, they're so easy that when I go through this, I hope this doesn't become one of those sessions that 20 minutes in, I'm done. But they're really easy to set up, whether you're the person who's sending the notifications or receiving them. They're just easy to use. They're also language agnostic, so it doesn't really matter what language you're using. Of course, we all love Xojo, so we're going to be using that for these, but it really doesn't matter what the other or what the two systems are that are talking to each other. They don't even need to know what language they were developed in. They're also extremely efficient. So when I show you this, a couple of slides in, I'll show you how these take loads off of both the client and the server. And we all want to do that as much as we possibly can. But I think one of the coolest things about webhooks is that they are instantaneous, so that when that notification gets sent, it's the earliest possible time that you can let system B know that something happened on system A. So again, you'll see that in a moment. So let's talk about how they work. So let's suppose that we have I'll call it a client and a server, and something happens on the server, some event. For example, when I show you one of the demos, I'm going to show you Eddie's Electronics, which everybody here is familiar with the Eddie's sample app. We all kind of grew up learning on it, I think. So let's suppose that you're in the Eddie's app and something happens, like somebody creates a new invoice or adds a customer. Well, that's an event that's happening on the server, and we need to let some other system, which we'll call the client, know that that has happened. So as soon as the event happens on the server sends that data to the client, and that's the webhook notification. So it's instantaneous. As soon as the event happens, we send the data. And then the client says, hey, got it, thank you. And that's webhooks in a nutshell. I'm done, I'll see you. But if you go back and you look at, I'm going the wrong way. If you look at this, it starts to look a lot like an API where you have something requesting something from another system. But if you look at it, it's kind of like an API in reverse, right? Instead of the client asking the server for data, you've got the server saying, hey, I've got some data that I think you want. And so just to kind of explain again like how they're different, webhooks are often called reverse APIs because, again, instead of a client pulling data from the server, you've got the server saying, here's some data that you need or that I think you want. So with an API, you have the client sending requests for data to the server, and the server responds. With the webhook, you've got the server sending data, and it's sending it as soon as it's available. And so the benefit of this is that the client doesn't have to constantly ask the server, do you have anything for me? Do you have anything for me? It's a don't call us, we'll call you approach. And so here's a way of kind of looking at that graphically. So you've got the client on the top, server on the bottom, and over time, you've got the client, and again, this is with a normal API situation. You've got a client just constantly asking the server, do you have any data? No. Do you have any data? No. And then eventually, hopefully, when the client asks the server for data, there is something that's there. Could be, again, like a new order, could be new customers, whatever the data is, it doesn't really matter. But then you slip right back into the constant polling of data, or of requests to the server, like, do you have data? Do you have data? Whereas with the webhook model, it's extremely simple. The server just says, I've got data for you, here it is. The client just responds with something like, I got it. Does that make sense? So, yeah. So the question was, can you do it asynchronously to the point that the client really doesn't have to respond? And the answer is yes. When I show you the demo, that's actually what I'm doing. So basically the server sends a notification to the client, and then the client sends back hey, I got it, but the server it doesn't care. So, question? Yeah. Right, so the question is this really the server pushing data to the client as opposed to saying, hey, I've got data that I think you might want, do you want it? So yeah, so the answer is that webhook notification is actually a payload of data. Like, here's an invoice for you. Yeah, so the question is, can we assume that the client has to subscribe to that data? And absolutely, you have to let the server know that I exist, that when this event occurs, I want you to send the data to me. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment.
So if the server shows up with my client needs to respond to it, and that's who's got it. There's not an actual protocol
Yeah, so the comment was when the client responds with got it, and I'm being kind of cute there, the way that you actually let the server know that, hey, I got the message you sent is typically with an HTTP status code, and it's typically a 200 response, which means okay. And I'm going to show you in just a minute that I'm actually not using that. There's a better code for that. Any other questions before I continue on? I like the questions because it's making my session seem longer. I've reached that point in the presentation where time is expanding and contracting. Okay. So let me switch to doing a demo. So the first demo I'm going to show you is what we refer to as a webhook listener. So in other words, this is a Xojo app that's sitting out on the web somewhere, and I'll talk about that in a minute too, like where it can live, if you will. That's basically listening for those, hey, I've got some data for you. Right, so I'm going to show you the green part of this situation first. So first, I'm actually just going to run it and send some, I'm going to simulate that, hey, I've got data for you, and show you that it's working. And then I'm going to back out and show you the code that makes it work. I know that's really hard to see because you can't see the navigator, but I think the code's big enough, right? You guys can see that? Yeah, I don't think so. Can you guys see it in the back? Is it big enough? No? All right. Is that better? It's 24 points. Really? I give up then. It's too big, yeah. I don't think that ever happens, right? Okay, so I'm going to run the app, and then I'll come back in and explain what this is. All right, so the app is running. Whoop. And to simulate that sending of the data, I've used this application in past presentations, but this is a Mac app called Paw that it's P-A-W. And if you're on Macs and you're doing API work, I highly recommend it. You can use it to really test APIs, do all kind of crazy stuff. If you want to talk to me about this, I could go on and on and on about why I love this app. But what I'm going to do is actually use it to send a post to the app that's running. Now, this is all running locally on my machine here. So I'm going to send it to that app that you saw me just launch. I'm just going to send this payload, which actually is just a JSON. I know it's probably hard for you guys to see it in the back, but it's just a JSON encoded payload. And when I send it, everything looks so weird up here. On the left-hand side is the payload I sent, and notice on the right-hand side, that's the response that I got back. I got a funky-looking number, which I'll explain in a minute. But then most importantly, in the top right corner, you can see the status code that I got back, which you were saying earlier about how it's normally a 200. This is a, yeah. So anything in the 200 range, when you send an HTTP request, whether it's to a web server or an API, that typically means that it was successful. In this case, we're doing a 202, or you got a 202 response, which really, if you look it up, it means accepted. And basically what that means is that the server said, hey, I got it, but I haven't done anything with it yet. So your job's done. I got what you sent. It's up to the server to actually do something with it. So I'm going to jump over to the Finder. And there's a file that is generated, which is hard to see. Let me copy this. And I'm actually going to open it up in Paw. I realize this. How, do you guys know how to zoom? Like, command? Let's. Option. Come on. So it's what? Shift Command.
So now hold down Option.
Right there. Got it. Ah, all right.
Also use scroll gesture. Put that in the check.
Got it.
Now if you hold down the control key, you just scroll up or down, it'll zoom in.
Ah, look at that. All right. So I learned something new today, too. So I know it's still hard to see, right, because it's gray on white. No, not that good. So the question was, did the scrolling send a webhook? It didn't. What I did was I grabbed the data that was in that text file and pulled it out, and I put it in Paul so that you guys could see it, but basically it's a JSON file that I wrote out to disk. And so what happened was, when I simulated sending that webhook, the listener took the data and created this and saved it out to disk. This is what my demo webhook listener is doing. Let me send another file, or another request. Right. I'm going to send a second notification, maybe. I'm going to jump over here real quick, and if you watch, I know you guys probably can't see it. I guess if I zoom in, there's another file that just showed up right there. So again, it's got that same funky number that you saw come in over on Paul, that number right there. And now I'll explain what all that actually means. So when the webhook notification was received by the listener, I assign it an ID, and the ID is just based on the date and the time. You haven't figured that out yet. And then I'm just writing it out to disk. I'm just basically logging the fact that the notification came in. Now you could, in your listener, do all kinds of stuff with the notification. For example, you could update a database. You could send an email notification. You could do all kinds of things, and a combination of things. But just for the demo, I'm choosing just to save them out to disk. Let me jump back over to the app itself. And so this is that Xojo app. And let me zoom it out a little bit. So for this particular app, it's actually a Xojo web application. And what I'm doing is I'm basically using the handle URL event handler to look for incoming web requests. And I don't know if you guys can actually see all that or not, but if it's a post, in other words, if it's a notification that's been sent in or a request that's been sent in via the HTTP post method, which is how you send webhooks, which I'll show you in just a moment, I'm actually kicking off an instance of this special class that I've created that then takes the request and does something with it. If it's not a post, I just serve up some simple HTML, which ends up looking like this. So that's if you happen to make a GET request to this app, that's what you get. But when the post comes in other words, a notification has been received, I create an instance of this class, which is actually a subclass of a Xojo thread. And when the instance is created, I parse it. In other words, I take all the data that's in the web request and I kind of make it easy for you to use to process the request. I assign an ID to it, which is this part right here, which I'll dig into the methods in just a moment. And then here's where I actually set the response status to that 202 that I mentioned. And then I print the ID out that was assigned to the request when it came in. So I do all that in the constructor, and then going back up to the handle URL, I then run the thread. And the reason I'm using threads is I want to respond as quickly as possible back to the server to say, hey, I got it. Again, I haven't done anything with it yet, but I've received it, thanks. And then I kind of get it off the main thread, basically. So when the thread actually runs, you can see I've added a step in here to kind of simulate some other long-running process. And I'm basically making the thread sleep for 5 seconds just so you can see the pause. I then encode the response. In other words, this is what I'm going to do with the request that came in. I'm going to create a JSON object, and then I'm going to save it out to disk. And this is the code to do all that. Now again, in your run event handler, you could do all kinds of stuff. You could send emails, update databases, really anything you can imagine.
So you're, every time you get one of these messages, you're creating a new instance of the class that you're at.
Yep.
I'm doing something similar, but what I do is I just stuff this receive into an array, and then I have a thread that's running all the time, and it just processes stuff. It processes the zero
Right.
identity in the array, and then starts again back at zero again, and removes it.
Yeah.
It's constantly getting it.
Yeah. So the comment was that you could also, rather than firing up an instance of that particular class like I'm doing there, you could put the requests that are coming in basically into a queue and then constantly be looking to see if there's anything in the queue. And that's actually one of the best practices. When I get to the best practices slides, I'm going to give you the do as I say, not as I do advice. But yes, it's a great approach because that you're able to process an even greater number of notifications coming in. So that's the listener. Before I continue on, did that make sense? It made sense to me, but now that I'm actually up here saying it, I'm wondering if it made any sense at all. Has everybody got it?
Why are you sleeping again?
I'm only doing that just to prove I did it for myself to prove that I was able to get the thing onto the thread and that the thread made sense. You could actually see the pause, like if I send that request again. I'm going to make it so you can see both screens. But you can see there's the two notifications that had come in. If I run this one again, there's a deliberate pause, but the response was immediate, right? And then eventually, 5 seconds, there's the out. So you obviously wouldn't want to put that into production unless that's your thing. Like, I'm going to deliberately slow my code down. No, that's not a best practice. Any other questions on the listener side? You could. You mean so the question is, I'm showing the listener in the context of a Xojo web application. And I think the question is, could you also kind of simulate or build a listener into a desktop app? Is that, yeah, or even a console app? You could, in the past I've spoken about Allo, which is a Xojo-based web server module, if you will. And you could use that to kind of pull this off as well. The code would be a little bit different. But yeah, you'd still have to host it. So the question is, you still need it to be publicly accessible somewhere. And yeah, I mean, really we're just talking about well, I suppose you could run it on a desktop app as long as you could route the traffic to wherever it's listening. But so the question is, could you, do it through using like WebSockets? And yeah, I mean, I think you certainly could, but I would recommend using a Xojo web application in this example, or using something like Allo, where you're firing up essentially a server that is listening somewhere. You could probably use this approach to facilitate communications within a network, which is an interesting concept, but I'm not sure I would.
The reason I use the web app is I stick it on the server that runs the business.
Yeah.
Another thing you can do, I noticed you said you just do it in your UI is announcing that this is a web app. One of the things that I do is I have a container that has two text areas in my transaction log information one, exception log information the other, so that you can look at any points that you can
Yeah, so the comment was that, there's some other things that you could do with a web app to sort of track exceptions and logging, and yeah, it's just, there's a lot of different ways you could kind of use this approach. One of the reasons that I like doing this as a Xojo web app is that really everything's there for you. I mean, I'm hijacking the app by using handle URL, but I just pulled this other slide up because these are some other things that are worth noting. Because they're a Xojo web app, you could actually host these using Xojo Cloud, which is pretty cool. You could also include that listener code. You saw me sort of in the handle URL. You could actually just put that into an existing Xojo web app if you've got one. And so in your handle URL, you would just check to see, is this a webhook that's coming in? And if so, process it. If not, let the Xojo web app handle it. Because, in other words, you could build this right into an existing app.
You can actually use these to talk to other web apps. For instance, one of the things, I've got an application that's on before was to read a barcode off of a piece of something being manufactured. That is in a web app. It sends a message to another web app, process that
Yeah, so the comment is that you could start to basically chain these things together, and that's my third bullet there, that this example that I'm using here is extremely basic because I didn't want to get into, well, let's see what it's like to send an email notification or update a database. You could certainly do all that, but one of the things you could do, and that's what I've got down there, you could send notifications off to other systems. So basically at this point then you've kind of built middleware. You're listening for the webhook notification coming in, and then you're sending that off to a whole bunch of other systems, which is an interesting concept. So the second demo is, what about, let me back up here, what about the other side of this equation? So let's suppose that we want to build into an existing Xojo application the ability to send webhook notifications. So I'm talking about basically the blue side of this. And let me show you that. I'm going to run this program and then I'll come back and show you what it is. This should look very familiar to you. Paul, you built this, right? Eddie's? I apologize for stealing it. This was the easiest thing for me to build this into. And I figured everybody's familiar with it, so. Yeah, I bet a lot of us are, right? So what I did was I figured rather than try to show you guys some application that was, that we weren't familiar with, I'd show you this. I think everybody has at some point seen the Eddie's application. And what I've done is I've built webhook notifications into Eddie's in, I think, a remarkably small number of lines of code. Like I said early on in the slides, this can be really easy. But basically, I'm having it send webhook notifications when you add an invoice or edit an invoice. So let me show you that. Let me just make sure I didn't shut down the other app. So it's still listening. So I've got my webhook listener running, and it's listening on port 8080. And thankfully, Eddie's, the app, is running on port 9000. I think that's by default, the way the app is set up. So let me jump back over here. And I'm just going to click on one of these invoices and edit it. I'm going to change the quantity on this one item from, say, 5 to 50. And I'm going to click Update. Then I'm going to jump over here. And I don't know if you guys can see it or not, but the notification just came in. So if I open that up, just to kind of prove to you that it did send something that made sense. By the way, this is one of the neat things about Paul is if you want to examine JSON that came in, this is a real nice, quick way to do it. I don't know if you guys can see that or not, but basically there's the webhook notification. You can see I've assigned it the receipt ID. There's all the content that was sent, which includes the event type. You can see that it was basically saying, hey, an invoice was updated. Here's the invoice number. Here's the customer that maps to that invoice. Here's the amount. And then just a whole bunch of other things that I'm including that could be helpful. Things like the user agent, the remote address of where the thing came in from. So if you need to debug these, this can be very helpful. So that's a notification that an invoice was edited. Let me just very quickly show you one where I'm going to add an invoice. Add an item. And whoop. This is another reason why I put that 5-second pause in, so that I can prove to you that it really did create it. But there it is. And if I open it up, I don't know if you guys can see it. Let me zoom it up. This time the event type was that I created an invoice. You can see the invoice number, the amount, the customer number, again, all the information that this other system needs to basically say, oh yeah, there was a new invoice, and then it can act on it. So let me show you how that works. So in my Eddie's app, on the invoice details dialog, which is essentially this right here, when the person clicks the update button and that action fires, this is almost exactly what is in the original Eddie's sample app. As a matter of fact, if I scroll down, I've got a bookmark in here. I don't know if you guys can see it all in one shot, but that's it. Basically what I'm doing is I'm getting the invoice, which probably didn't even need to really do it again, but I'm calling a method that's on the session orders object that's already built into Eddie's, and just basically getting all the invoice information back. And then I'm creating a JSON object, setting a bunch of the properties, things like the event type, invoice number. And then I'm actually using URL connection to send the notification. So I'm setting the request, setting the content type. You can see at the bottom I'm sending it asynchronously. I'm just doing a post to my local machine. That's it. So I don't know how many lines of code that is. Probably less than 10 real lines of code. That's all it took. So when I said it was easy, that part really can be. Any questions?
What would happen if the client was behind a firewall?
So if the question is what would happen if the client is behind a firewall, if you're setting up that listener app, the client app, you're going to want to make sure that it is available to the outside world, at least if you want to have a firewall in place in front of it. You could set it up so that if you know the IP address the notifications are coming in from, you can set up a rule for that. But basically, if you think about it, the listener is really an API itself, right? So you want it to be somewhat publicly accessible. And I'm going to talk in a minute about how you can secure that a little bit. So, any other questions about the sending side of this? Are you guys starting to see like how this, you might be able to actually apply this in some of the things you're doing, or? Yeah, now you know the technical term for it. So his comment was he didn't realize that this was something he was already doing. What were you calling it? Yeah, it really is it truly is just an API that is listening for something. It's a reverse API like I had on that slide. It's a strange concept, but it makes sense. All right, let me jump back over to the slides. Right, whoop. So again, as far as the listeners go, I think the coolest thing is you could host these on Xojo Cloud, but if you've already got a Xojo web app that's sitting somewhere, it's really easy to build the listener portion of this into it. And if you've already got a Xojo web app that you're like you saw me with Eddie's, adding Webhook notification support to that can be really, really easy. There's a lot you can do with these things. So some of the popular services that are out there today, like platform as a service, software as a service, these are all services that offer webhooks. In other words, you can go into PayPal. Hal and I were talking about this last week, because he's like, when I explained to him what webhooks were, he said, that sounds a lot like PayPal's IPN, which is their instant payment notification service. And sure enough, yeah, PayPal supports them, Google Sheets. Almost every popular service these days supports webhooks, things like Stripe, Dropbox, and so on. So if you can imagine, like for example in Shopify, which is an e-commerce system, that you wanted to have Shopify tell your Xojo app that an order has come in, it's really easy to do. Question? Yeah, so his comment was that's exactly what he's doing. He's basically, it sounds like you've got webhooks set up inside of Shopify and it's sending it to an Allo app, which is ultimately making its way down to a desktop app. Yeah, Shopify has a really nice, support for webhooks. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Wufoo. That's one of those online form builders. It's really nice as well. Basically, it's an online form creation system, and you can say, hey, when someone submits this form, it's going to save it in a database in that service, but you can also tell it that when somebody fills the form out, let me know, send the notification off to the system. Twilio supports it, Instagram, my guess is if you're using a popular online service, it probably supports it. Question? Mm-hmm. So the question is, if you want to get a notification on a desktop app that something happened in an external system, how do you get it to go all the way down the chain, basically, right? So basically, in that case, you're going to have to pull something, right? You're going to have your desktop app. Maybe it's constantly looking at a database, looking to see if some new orders came in, whatever. But it's basically, you're back to polling again, right? Yeah, pretty much. I don't think you can push all the way down to a desktop app unless your desktop app, like to Kim's point, like it has to be sitting there listening actually for the notification, right? Right. Okay.
Basically, write the app, it's running on a web server, it's not running locally, and then when the notification comes into the web app, then refresh that information to the client session.
Yeah.
What if you have it's grew up with that question? You can do that by creating your original application, getting it locally, on that computer, and basically run it in there. And then with that application, just send something over my PC circuit to the original application. And that way you can make it the helper app. That's actually
Yeah, so the general comment is that it is possible to get the notifications and go all the way down to the desktop app, but one way or another, you're going to have something that's listening for those notifications coming in, which means you need to route the request into your network. There was another question.
Yeah, so let's say your listener app is not running.
Mm-hmm.
This protocol is such that the sender is not going to reach it.
We're going to get to that, but yes, you're absolutely. So the comment was, suppose that the listener is down for some reason. Maybe the network's down, the app's crashed. That never happens. No. So the network's down. It could even be that the server is having trouble sending the notifications, right? So those are things you have to take into account. You cannot rely 100% on webhooks, right? They're really nice, but we need to build in backups, essentially, for that, or contingencies, which brings me to best practices. So I've got 2 slides on best practices. The first one has to do with the server side of it, in other words, thing that's going to send the notifications. And let me read through some of these, because some of them are obvious and some of them are not. The first one is send complete webhook notifications. So Kim, I think it was you that asked, when the server sends the notification, is it just letting the client know that there's something that they need to get, or is it the data itself? And again, it is the data itself. More importantly, as a best practice, send as much data as you think the client wants. So I said earlier that I should preface this by saying, do as I say, not as I do. But if you remember, when I sent the notification for that new invoice, I sent the invoice number, the customer ID, the amount, but I didn't send everything about the invoice. I should have probably sent the customer's name, what products they purchased, right? What you don't want to do is have the client have to then turn around and call an API to say, hey, I got this notification on an invoice, but I need more information on it. Just try to send it all at once if you can. Does that make sense? Include a timestamp and an ID in the notifications so that if you need to debug these things, it's easy to try to figure out what webhook it was, what time it was generated, which in a moment I'll talk more about how you would debug some of this, but those can go a long way to helping you debug. So support multiple events. You saw that the 2 notifications that I'm sending out of Eddie's both had to do with invoices, right? A creation of an invoice, updating an invoice. But I really should have notifications for things like, a customer was created, customer was edited, an invoice was deleted, a new item was added. Try to make it so that you have as much support for those events as possible, as many types of events. Support for multiple URLs. So with that one, let's suppose that as the client, I've got multiple systems that I want the notifications to go to. If your webhook support on the server side is robust enough, you could actually let a client go in and say, when a new invoice is created, I want you to send a notification here, and I'd like you to send a notification over here, because you probably have multiple systems on the back end that might need to know about that event. Provide subscribers with a way to easily tell you what URLs you want them to send the notifications to. So that can be in the app itself. Maybe you create an API for them to register. This goes back to the question about subscribing to these. Make it easy for your clients to basically tell you where to send the notifications. Provide a way to send a test notification. This is a good one too. What you don't want to do is have the client set up the URL and then sit back and wait for the first notification to come through before they realize that something's wrong. So if you can have it in your app, have it send even if it's just a sample notification, they can at least know that they're receiving the notifications and they know right away. Give the option to secure the webhooks using tokens. So you saw that when I sent that notification from the Eddie's app and the listener was sitting there, it just took the notification and then saved it out. I didn't do any authentication on it. anyone can send a notification to that app, and it's going to process it. But what I really should do is have a way to tell the server that when you send me a notification, I want you to include this ID. Think of it as an API key, really. And so if I get a notification in, and it's not from, it doesn't reference the correct API key or ID, then you reject it. Does that make sense? Right. So the comment was, you know, it really depends on your implementation as to whether or not you want to worry about authenticating the webhooks, and I completely agree. If you know the service that's sending is something that you have control over and you trust, this isn't critical. But I think for the most part, if the notifications are coming from an external system or from outside your network, you do want to put some really simple authentication in there. So support retries. This one's challenging, but it's, I think, important. It takes a little bit of extra work, and by retries, it basically means that when the server sends the request, you saw in my code, I'm sending the request, and I'm like, if they got it, great. If they didn't get it, tough, right? With retries, you send the request, and if you don't get back a 200 or a 202, in other words, if the client doesn't say, hey, I got it, thanks, try again. Maybe you try in 5 minutes, then you try 10 minutes later. Keep trying until it goes through or until you give up. You know, like you try 5 times over an hour and then you give up. Send email notifications when the webhooks fail. So going back to that retries approach, if I've tried a couple times and the client's still saying, or they're not responding with, hey, I got it, then maybe notify the client somehow, like via email, hey, we're trying to send you notifications, but they're failing. Right? There's nothing worse than finding out, you know, 5 days later that we haven't gotten any orders from Shopify or whatever. And then also, as far as the sort of recovering from an outage or some reason that a client isn't getting the notifications, you might want to give them a way to look at events. In other words, start logging the notifications that you've sent, you know, again, date, timestamp them, and give your clients a way to, like through an API call back to the server and say, hey, for whatever reason, I haven't gotten any notifications since this date and time. Can you give me them all back one more time? Does that all make sense? All right. On the client side, not as many bullets here, and a lot of them are really mirrors of what I just said on the server side. But first one is use HTTPS, secure your listener for obvious reasons, I think. If possible, validate the webhooks. Again, if the server will let you tell it, here's the token that I want you to send when you send me the notification. That's when you would do the validation. Going back to that queuing concept, you can use a service like Amazon's SQS, Simple Queue service. Basically, the idea there is that on the client side, when the notification comes in, maybe you don't do something with it right away. You put it on a queue and then have a whole bunch of other systems deal with that when they can. So it's a little bit more involved, but it depends on the volume of notifications that you're receiving. And then again, have a plan for dealing with missed notifications. You know, in other words, don't rely on these. And if for some reason there's an outage, have a plan for getting the data that you missed and identifying the data you missed, because that can be challenging. Any questions on that one? I think that's it. Any questions in general?
Well, just a thought while you're talking, going back to the question of getting these into desktop, we could set up a middleware web service that understands webhooks on the client side and webhooks on the server side.
Right.
Then sockets on the client side. Client registers for a webhook as a service, tells it to send notifications to the middleware. Middleware sends it down to the client.
Yeah, so the comment was that you could facilitate notifications in, say, a desktop app or even an iOS app, if you think about it, right? You could, there's a bunch of different ways to kind of get notifications sent down to the ultimate client, if you will. And you do that by create like that listener app that I have. It's essentially middleware. It's just sitting there. And so again, whether you're updating a database, you're sending like a push notification or an SMS, I mean, the sky is the limit. But yeah, it's a good point. Sure. So again, do as I say, not as I do, in that, sorry, the question was, I wasn't clear about how you register for notifications, and in that particular example with the Eddies app, you saw that I hard-coded in, like, you know, when these events occur, fire it off, and I did that just for simplicity. There really should be like a settings area in there where you say, you know, when this event occurs, do this, do that. But yeah. Yeah, so the services I listed typically either have an API or they have a UI, like a web-based, like you log into your account. Yeah, Shopify has both. And, yeah. Right, so yeah, a good service is going to give you the ability to log into a web app and put those things in, but then also give you an API so that you can update it. What's nice about the API approach is that if you think your listener is going to be changing often, or you want to change the token for the authentication, you can very easily do that programmatically instead of having to log in and keep the codes up to date.
Yeah, how do you protect against attacks? I mean, most people don't really much from doing the.
So the question is, what's to prevent you from, or how do you protect yourself from attacks? It's really just like any other service that's sitting out there, whether it's an API or a website, right? Hide under the covers. Well, there's certain things I would recommend. Number one, obviously, putting it behind a firewall to some extent so that only the ports that need to be open are open. You know, put it over HTTPS. I would recommend putting, if you're not using, maybe, and well, I don't know, with the changes coming to Xojo Cloud, you know, we're probably going to be able to do load balancing and handle an unsophisticated attack, if you will, in terms of being flooded with notifications. But if you're running behind something like Nginx, you can actually put you know, limits, rate limits, in terms of how many requests are allowed to hit your app over a certain period of time. So there's certain things that are things you can do to kind of mitigate it. But again, I think the most use Cloudflare. The other, obviously though, I think the best thing you could do is just authenticate the requests coming in so that if they don't know the API key or the token, that you just reject them. Just, sorry, I don't know who you are. So. Any other questions? No? Did I go too quick? Wow, all right, great, thanks guys, I appreciate it.